Sona stood in the hospital room, cradling the newborn baby against her chest. Her heart was full of love, and tears of joy streamed down her cheeks. But Richard didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't take a step toward them. He stared at the baby boy with a frozen face. Not a single trace of warmth showed in his eyes. Instead, his jaw tightened, and something cold flickered across his face, something she had never seen before. "Who is the father?" he asked, voice low, trembling with anger. "What?" Sona gasped, blinking fast. "You are Richard. You're the father." His face darkened. "He doesn't look like me." Sona clutched the baby tighter. "He has your eyes." Richard's gaze dropped to the baby's brown skin, and he shook his head. "No, that's not possible. That's not my son." And in that moment, everything broke. He walked out of the hospital room, out of her life, and out of their son's future, without looking back. 3 years before that day, Richard Paul had been the man of her dreams. They met at a charity dinner. Sona was catering the event, and Richard was the guest of honor. She remembered the way he looked at her, not just at the food she served, but at her. Like he saw something beyond her white chef's coat and quiet smile. "You made this?" he asked, pointing to the tiny crab cakes. "Yes," Sona replied, trying not to blush. "Do you like it?" "I don't just like it," he said, his smile gentle. "I think I'm falling in love with your cooking." She laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't know then that she was also falling for the man in front of her. A tech mogul, a millionaire, the kind of man who lived in tall buildings and moved in fast circles. But that night, Richard didn't act like a man above her. He listened. He laughed at her stories. He asked about her restaurant dreams. And he didn't seem to care that she came from a small town or that her skin was darker than his. They began dating quietly. Nights filled with soft music and long talks. He would stop by her apartment with takeout just to hear about her day. She would visit his office and bring him homemade lunch. He would sneak her into high-end events, his hand always holding hers. She thought she had found a safe place in his world. It was fast, maybe too fast, but Sona didn't care. Neither did Richard. Within 6 months, they were married. And when she told him she was pregnant, he lifted her off the ground in joy. He kissed her belly every night. He spoke to the baby through her skin. He even picked out the name, Michael. So when the day came and she held their baby in her arms, she never expected his love to vanish like smoke. Sona remembered the first time Richard said he loved her. They were walking through Central Park after one of her late-night shifts. The streets were nearly empty, and she was still in her chef's coat, her hair pulled back messily. She felt out of place beside him. He wore a tailored coat, sleek and rich, like everything in his life. "I'm sorry I look a mess," she whispered, trying to smooth her hair. Richard stopped walking. "Don't say that," he said, gently taking her hand. "You're beautiful, even with flour on your nose." She laughed, and he reached up to wipe it off. "There," he said softly. "Perfect." Then, under a quiet street lamp, he said it. "I love you, Sona." Her breath caught in her throat. She'd dreamed of this moment, but hearing the words made her knees feel weak. She hadn't expected it to come from him, the man everyone said was too powerful, too closed off to love someone like her. She whispered, "I love you too." And she meant it. From that moment, things moved quickly. Richard invited her to move in. He showed her parts of his world she'd never seen, weekends at private villas, art galleries, silent auctions. And through it all, he kept looking at her like she was the only thing that made sense. But Sona also noticed the way some people looked at them in public, especially his business partners. The way some smiled too tightly, the way some women whispered, and the way Richard would sometimes go silent when they were around. Once at a company gala, a woman from his board said, "Oh, Richard, I didn't know you were into exotic types." Sona had smiled politely, swallowing the sting, but Richard said nothing. Later that night, when she brought it up, he waved it off. "They're just old-fashioned. Ignore them." But the silence stayed with her. Still, she believed in them. When she found out she was pregnant, her joy was like the sunrise. She told Richard with trembling hands and a hopeful heart. And he cried, really cried, held her tight, and promised he would protect her and the baby no matter what. They spent hours talking about baby names, nursery colors, lullabies. Sona thought this baby would bring them even closer. She was wrong. The birth was hard. Sona went through 16 hours of labor, pain cutting through her body like fire. But when she held her son for the first time, it all melted away. His tiny fingers, his small nose, his big, curious eyes. "He's here," she whispered. "Our baby is here." She couldn't wait for Richard to see him. But when he entered the room and saw the baby, his whole body froze. His hands didn't reach for the child. His eyes didn't shine like before. Something was off. "He's brown," Richard muttered, blinking as if the child was a stranger. Sona sat up, her heart thudding. "Yes. He looks like my side of the family. My grandmother was darker-skinned. It's normal." Richard didn't reply. He stepped back. "You think I cheated on you?" she asked in disbelief. "Richard, look at me. This is your son." But he kept staring at the baby, his jaw locked. "People will talk," he said quietly. "My family, my company." Sona felt her chest tighten. "Our son is not a shame." "I need time," he said, backing toward the door. And before she could say another word, he walked out. The hospital room grew cold after Richard left. Sona stared at the door for a long time, hoping, praying, he would walk back in. He didn't. The nurse entered quietly. "Do you need anything, ma'am?" Sona shook her head, tears running down her face as she held baby Michael close. "I just want to go home." The nurse nodded with gentle eyes. She didn't ask questions. She just wrapped Sona's coat around her and helped her to the car. Outside, the world looked different. The sky was gray, and the wind was sharp. Nothing looked the way it did when Richard first told her he loved her. Now she was going home alone. No husband. No welcome. Just her and her baby. She had no plan. No money saved. And no idea how she'd go back to work with a newborn. But when Michael stirred in her arms and let out a soft cry, she wiped her tears. "I've got you," she whispered. "We're going to be okay." Weeks passed. Then months. Sona tried calling Richard once. Just once. He didn't answer. Instead, she received divorce papers in the mail. No apology. No explanation. Just clean, cold ink on white paper. His lawyer said he wanted a clean break. No child support. No co-parenting. Nothing. Sona signed the papers with trembling hands. She found a small apartment above a laundromat. The walls were thin, and the heater rattled at night, but it was hers. She took night shifts at a nearby diner. It wasn't like the fine catering she used to do, but it paid enough to keep the lights on. During the day, she raised Michael. She sang to him, fed him, rocked him to sleep, and whispered stories about the man he'd never know. She didn't speak badly about Richard. But when Michael was old enough to ask, "Where's Daddy?" Sona would look away and say softly, "He couldn't stay, baby. But you're so loved." There were days when she broke down in the kitchen, crying over dishes because the pain felt too big. But she always wiped her eyes and kept going. Michael needed her, and she refused to let the world tell him he wasn't enough. By the time Michael turned 5, Sona saw something in him, something strong and bright. He was kind and curious, always asking questions. "Why do we have to live upstairs from a laundry? Why don't I have a daddy? Why do people stare at us in the grocery store?" Sona never lied, but she chose her words carefully. "We don't have a lot, but we have love," she'd say. "And that's enough for now." Michael grew up watching his mother work until her feet bled. He saw her come home late, hair messy, apron stained, but still smiling when she tucked him in. He knew they didn't have much, but he never felt poor. Sona made sure of that. She filled their world with books, food, and warmth. She taught him how to cook eggs when he was 6 and how to fold laundry when he was 7. And when he came home crying one day because a kid at school said he didn't look like other boys, she knelt down and held his face. "You are beautiful," she said. "You have your father's eyes, and you have my heart. But more than anything, you have your own fire. Never forget that." Michael didn't forget. He stopped crying after that. Instead, he started dreaming. Michael was different from other kids. Not just smart, focused. By the age of 9, He was reading books way above his grade level. He wasn't just learning for school. He was trying to understand the world. He asked questions that made adults pause. Why do some fathers leave? Do names change when people have power? What is justice? Sona answered what she could, but sometimes she just listened. Michael didn't talk much about his father, but it was clear the absence shaped him. It made him curious. It made him hungry for answers. And even at that age, it made him angry. Not the kind of anger that makes you loud, but the kind that makes you quiet, determined. He didn't act out. He studied harder. He became sharper. Sona noticed. She watched him with pride, but also with worry. He was going somewhere big, she could feel it, but part of her feared what he'd find when he got there. When Michael turned 10, Sona did something bold. She opened a food cart. It wasn't a restaurant, not yet, but it was hers. Just a small metal cart on the corner near a college campus. She served hot meals, her famous butter chicken, spicy lentil soup, handmade samosas. At first, people ignored her. Then the smell started drawing them in. One college student took a bite and said, "This tastes like home." Soon word spread. Every morning, she packed the cart. Every night, she cleaned it down to the bolts. Michael helped her when he wasn't at school, wiping counters, folding napkins, taking orders with a polite smile. They worked as a team. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were building. And Sona, for the first time in years, started to dream again. Across town, Richard Paul sat in a glass office at the top of a tech tower. His company had grown even larger, more contracts, more cities, more attention. But none of it felt real anymore. He was engaged now, to a woman from a wealthy family. The kind his board approved of. They smiled at each other in public, but there was no fire, no warmth. He had everything money could buy. Yet sometimes, late at night, he found himself staring out the window, haunted by a small face he had walked away from years ago. He never spoke about Sona. He never admitted what he'd done. But every time he saw a child that looked a little too familiar in the crowd, his chest tightened. Every time he read about discrimination in the news, he looked away. He had told himself what he did was necessary, for his image, for his future. But the silence was louder than ever now. And somewhere deep inside he knew. The past wasn't finished with him. Michael was 12 when he saw his mother cry for the first time in years. She had just come home from the city office, holding a wrinkled paper in her hand. A big corporation had bought the lot her food cart stood on. They were forcing vendors out. No notice. No warning. They said, "I'm not part of the future," she whispered, sitting on their worn-out couch. Just like that. Michael didn't say a word at first. He just sat beside her. His eyes burned, not with tears, but with something deeper. That night, while Sona slept, Michael sat with the eviction notice and searched everything he could about business law, land use, and property rights. He couldn't stop thinking, what if I knew how to fight for her? What if I could protect her the way she's always protected me? By the next morning, he had made up his mind. "I'm going to be a lawyer," he said, looking her in the eyes. Sona stared at him, blinking back tears. "I believe you," she whispered. Sona didn't give up. Instead of waiting for permission, she found a way around the system. A small cafe space on the edge of town became available, old, dusty, and nearly forgotten. No one wanted it. But she saw possibility. The warmth in the food matches the woman behind it. It was still small, still humble, but it was hers. And every night, after locking up, she'd sit in the back and look at a picture Michael had drawn when he was little. A stick figure version of her, holding a spoon, wearing a crown. Nothing serious, yet. But investors were nervous. PR teams were scrambling. And Richard was restless. One night, while pacing his penthouse apartment, he picked up an old photo album. Buried between photos of award shows and fundraisers was a single fading image. Sona, laughing in his kitchen, stirring something on the stove, her belly round with pregnancy, his hand resting gently over hers. He stared at it. For a lawn there were whispers in the press. Allegations of unfair hiring practices. An employee filed a quiet lawsuit claiming racial bias in promotions. A few small protests began outside the headquarters. She took a chance, borrowing money from a friend and emptying her savings. She painted the walls herself, set up a tiny kitchen, and named it Sona's Table. At first, it was slow, but college kids followed her from the food cart days. Then came locals. Then came bloggers. The chef cooks with soul. People posted pictures of her dishes online with captions like, "The best food in the city, hands down." Reviews poured in. G time. And for the first time in years, he whispered her name. Sona. But before he could let the feeling settle, his phone rang. His assistant's voice was tense. "There's a law student asking questions about Paul Tekka's early investors," she said. "He's digging deep. Uncomfortably deep." Michael tightened the straps of his backpack as he hurried across campus, a crisp morning breeze ruffling his neatly pressed shirt. It was his first week of law school, and the air hummed with possibility and nervous energy. In a lecture hall filled with rows of eager students, Michael took a seat near the front. He pulled out a notebook, heart thudding in his chest. "You made it here," he reminded himself, thinking of his mother's proud smile that morning as she handed him a thermos of tea before he left for class. The professor began speaking about justice and the law's role in protecting the vulnerable. Michael listened intently, pen in hand, but his thoughts drifted to Sona, his mother. He remembered how she had fought every day for their little family, how she woke before dawn to prep her food cart, then eventually her small restaurant, all to provide for him. She had been both mother and father to him. Michael's jaw tightened. "I'll make her sacrifices worth it," he vowed silently. After classes ended that afternoon, Michael hopped on a bus across town. He arrived at Sona's Kitchen, the modest restaurant his mother had built from nothing. The savory scent of spiced stew and baked bread greeted him as he stepped inside. It was past the lunch rush, and Sona was wiping down tables, a loose strand of hair falling over her tired eyes. "You're early today," Sona said, surprised but pleased as Michael leaned in to kiss her cheek. "I wanted to help with the dinner prep," he replied, shrugging off his backpack. "And see you, of course." Sona gave him a gentle swat with the dish towel, her eyes warm. "School comes first. You don't need to be here every day, Michael." He shook his head with a small smile. "I know, but I want to be here. I miss your cooking." That drew a laugh from Sona. Together, they moved into the tiny kitchen. Michael rolled up his sleeves and started chopping vegetables, while Sona kneaded dough for the evening's bread. The rhythmic motions and the familiar aroma of garlic and onions sizzling in oil felt comforting. As they worked side by side, Sona glanced at her son. She noticed the faint dark circles under his eyes. "How are classes?" she asked softly. Michael paused, wiping his brow. "Challenging. Lots of reading already. But it's fascinating. Today we talked about why we need laws to protect people." He hesitated, then added, "It made me think of us, of everything you went through." Sona's hands slowed in the dough. Her eyes flickered with old hurt, but she tried to smile. "We got through it," she said quietly. "And look at you now. I'm so proud of you." He placed a hand over hers, flour dusting his fingers. "I wouldn't be here without you, Mom." They shared a tender silence, understanding passing between them. Sona squeezed his hand, then turned back to the dough, clearing her throat. "You should head home soon and study. I can handle things here." "Not yet," Michael insisted. "I'll stay through dinner rush." Before Sona could protest, the bell over the door jingled as a customer entered, and their conversation was put aside. Later that night, after the restaurant had closed and Sona had finally shooed Michael home to rest, he sat at the small desk in his bedroom. Textbooks and case printouts were spread open, but Michael's mind wasn't on homework. The house was quiet. His mother had gone to bed. In that stillness, Michael opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He took a deep breath and typed into the search bar, "Paul Tech Richard Paul Discrimination." A series of search results appeared, news articles, forum discussions, an entry on a tech business wiki. Michael's heart pounded. It wasn't the first time he had looked up his father's company, but now he had a purpose beyond personal curiosity. Ever since he'd witnessed an act of blatant injustice years ago, the one that pushed him toward law, he'd known that someday he would shine a light on hidden wrongs, especially those close to home. He clicked on a recent article. Paul Tech under scrutiny for discriminatory hiring practices. The article detailed allegations that Paul Tech favored certain candidates and sidelined others based on race and background. There were quotes from anonymous former employees describing a toxic culture that started at the top. Michael felt a surge of anger and a strange validation. It sounded like the company reflected its founders' prejudices. Scrolling further, Michael found a link to older public records. He clicked on a document that appeared to be a 20-year-old press release, archived on a financial news site. As the text loaded, Michael's eyes zeroed in on the date, just a few months after he was born. The headline announced a major early investment in Paul Tech by a venture capitalist named Gerald Thompson. Michael's brow furrowed. The name rang a distant bell from something he'd read in the past. He opened another tab and searched Gerald Thompson. Up came a handful of articles about a wealthy investor known for his aggressive tactics, and a scandal a decade ago involving unethical business practices at one of his companies. According to One Piece, Thompson had been accused of covering up safety violations and discriminating against minority employees in a manufacturing firm he owned, though he settled the case quietly out of court. Michael's pulse quickened. Gerald Thompson had pumped money into Paul Tech at its very inception. What kind of influence did a man like that have on Richard Paul? He wondered. Was it a coincidence that Richard divorced his wife and distanced himself from his newborn son around the same time he took money from this investor? Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. It was too soon to draw conclusions, but the timing made his stomach clench. He thought of his mother, young and hopeful back then, cast aside by the man she loved, by Michael's own father, because of Michael's skin color, because Michael wasn't the right kind of son for Richard's image. He swallowed hard, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in his damp eyes. If someone like Thompson had been whispering in Richard's ear, fueling his ambition and prejudice, then maybe there was more to uncover. Michael shut his laptop and gazed out the small window above his desk into the dark. The lights of the city twinkled back, and somewhere across town his father was likely in a penthouse or a mansion, oblivious to the son he had abandoned. Well, Michael whispered to himself, determination stiffening his voice, not for long. He closed his notebook, where he had jotted down Gerald Thompson's name with a question mark. This was just the beginning. Balancing law school and helping his mom was hard enough, but now Michael felt a new mission taking shape. It was time to dig into the past, quietly and carefully. He owed it to his mother, to himself, and maybe even to the truth, to find out what really happened and hold Richard Paul accountable for the choices he'd made. Autumn leaves skittered across the sidewalk as Michael stepped out of the campus library, a stack of photocopied legal cases tucked under his arm. Weeks had passed since he began his quiet investigation, and in between classes and helping at the restaurant, he spent late nights poring over documents that might link Paul Tech to wrongdoing. The more he uncovered, the more disturbed he became. One afternoon, Michael sat at a long wooden table in the law library, surrounded by dusty volumes and printouts. His laptop screen displayed a legal database search result. He had finally found something concrete, a reference to a lawsuit filed against Paul Tech about 18 years ago. It was a wrongful termination suit, alleging that a qualified engineer had been fired due to racial bias within the company. The case never went to trial. It was dismissed. Michael suspected a settlement had silenced it. His classmate and friend, Ravi, wandered over, slinging his backpack down. "You've been in here a lot," Ravi remarked, keeping his voice low out of respect for the quiet room. Researching for Professor Lee's assignment already. Michael quickly clicked his laptop screen off. He mustered a casual smile. "Just reviewing some cases for personal interest." Ravi raised an eyebrow. "Personal interest, huh? You sure you're not secretly gunning for a spot on the law review already?" Michael chuckled softly. "Nothing like that. I just got curious about corporate law, discrimination cases, and such." Ravi nodded, sitting across from him. "I heard about that Paul Tech fiasco on the news. My uncle works in tech. He said everyone's talking about it. Apparently, their CEO is under a lot of pressure." Michael's heart skipped. He tried to keep his tone even. "Really? What kind of pressure? Oh, media backlash, investors getting antsy. Some diversity advocacy groups are looking into them. There's talk of a possible inquiry. Ravi shrugged as if it were just another news bit. Why the sudden interest? You got stocks in Paul Tech or something? Michael shook his head quickly. No, nothing like that. I just hate companies that think they're above treating people fairly. At that, Ravi grinned. Here, here. That's why you'll make a great lawyer, man. Always fighting the good fight. He glanced at his watch. I gotta run to class. Don't drown in too many books. As Ravi left, Michael exhaled slowly. It was comforting to know that external pressure on Paul Tech was mounting. It wasn't just him against his father's empire. Others had noticed the cracks too. But Michael's quest was deeply personal, and he needed evidence that went beyond rumors. That evening, after classes, Michael had dinner ready when Sona returned from a restaurant. He had cooked a simple stir-fry, and they sat in their cozy living room to eat. The TV murmured softly in the background with the evening news. Sona looked at her son, sensing a weight on his mind. You've been quiet tonight, she said gently, resting a hand on his arm. Is everything okay? How's school? Michael forced a small smile. School's good. Just a lot on my plate. He twirled his fork, debating how much to tell her. He hated keeping secrets from his mother, but he didn't want to worry her, not until he had something solid. I've been doing some extra research about Paul Tech. At the mention of the company, Sona's hand stiffened slightly on his arm. Her eyes held his, concern and a flicker of old pain visible. Michael, I know, he said quickly. I know it's hard to hear that name. I'm sorry. It's just there are things about that company, about Richard, that I need to know. They're under scrutiny for discrimination. If there's any truth to it, then it's part of a pattern, isn't it? Sona looked down at her plate, her appetite gone. I never wanted you to carry this burden, she whispered. I tried so hard to raise you without hatred in your heart, without the shadow of what he did looming over you. You did, Mom. Michael reached over and clasped her hand. I don't hate him, but I can't forget either. Especially not if he's hurting other people, not just us. If his company has been treating people unfairly, people like us, someone has to hold him accountable. Sona's eyes shone with unshed tears. She nodded slowly, squeezing his hand. Just promise me you'll be careful. Richard, he's a powerful man. Going up against him or his company could be dangerous. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you. Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. I promise I'll be careful. I'm just gathering information for now. After clearing the dishes, Sona insisted Michael get some rest. Instead, he ended up back at his desk, the house quiet around him. With a determined breath, he opened a new file on his computer and began compiling everything he had found. Dates, names, case numbers, news clippings. At the top he typed, Paul Tech investigation. He listed the wrongful termination lawsuit and the hints of a settlement. He noted the early investor, Gerald Thompson, and started outlining Thompson's known unethical dealings. Piece by piece, a puzzle was forming. Michael suspected that in Paul Tech's early days, Richard Paul might have compromised his morals for success, perhaps even at the expense of his own family. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Paul sat alone in his dimly lit home office, nursing a glass of whiskey. It was late, but sleep had eluded him for weeks. On his desk, a stack of reports demanded his attention. HR summaries, legal notices, PR recommendations, all regarding the discrimination allegations. Richard ran a hand through his graying hair. Every page felt like an accusation pointed directly at him, dredging up memories he tried to bury. In the quiet of his large, empty house, Richard's mind wandered back 20 years. He could still picture Sona's face on the last day they spoke. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she held their infant son in her arms. Our son. Richard shut his eyes tight, pain slicing through him. Michael's tiny face appeared in his memory, a baby with bright, curious eyes and soft brown skin. At the time, Richard's fear and ambition had blinded him. He had told himself he was making the hard choice for the greater good of his company's future, that Sona and the baby would be better off without him complicating their lives. It was a lie he'd repeated to himself countless times. He stared at a photo frame on the corner of his desk, one of him shaking hands with Gerald Thompson at a long-ago Paul Tech launch event. Richard's jaw clenched. Gerald had believed in Paul Tech when no one else did, but his money came with expectations. Richard remembered the subtle comments Gerald made about family distractions and maintaining a certain image to secure further investments. At first, Gerald didn't even know Richard's fiancée was Indian and that their child would be of mixed race, until someone must have told him or he saw a photo. Richard recalled how suddenly Gerald's attitude changed, how he grew cool, and began to question Richard's commitment to the business. The pressure had been immense. In a moment of weakness, Richard caved. He chose Paul Tech over his heart. The memory made him sick now. He gulped the rest of the whiskey, but the burn did nothing to numb his regret. Richard's vision blurred with tears. He wondered what had become of Sona and that little boy. The boy would be a young man now, perhaps in college or starting a career. Richard had kept tabs from a distance to ensure they were at least financially stable. Through an anonymous trust, he'd sent money once or twice early on, but Sona returned the checks each time without a word. Eventually, he stopped trying, too ashamed to push further. They had disappeared from his life as thoroughly as if they had never existed. At least that's what he pretended to the world. Now, with every headline accusing his company of prejudice, Richard felt the ghost of his past rising. He couldn't escape the irony that the very bias he'd shown to his own flesh and blood was surfacing in his company culture. Perhaps it had seeped in through him, like a stain he couldn't wash out. He pressed the photograph of Sona and Michael to his chest and made a decision he had been avoiding for years. Richard would find out what happened to Sona and their child. He needed to know, even if he had no right to step back into their lives. Perhaps if he could just see that they were okay, it might ease the guilt clawing at him. And if they weren't okay, Richard wasn't sure he could handle that knowledge. But first, he had to deal with the fires at Paul Tech. He placed the photo back in the drawer and locked it, swallowing back his emotions. He would call his private investigator in the morning to discreetly gather information. For now, he had a company to protect. On the other side of the city, Michael clicked on one last document before bed, an old newspaper column that nearly made his heart stop. It was a business gossip piece from years ago, speculating on Richard Paul's abrupt divorce. The columnist hinted at pressure from unnamed investors and noted the unfortunate timing. Shortly after the birth of his first child, CEO Richard Paul and his wife divorced under mysterious circumstances, even as his fledgling company received a significant cash infusion. The words on the screen blurred as Michael's eyes burned. There it was in black and white, a suggestion that his father's abandonment might have been tied to business interests. Michael's hands trembled with anger and sorrow. So it was true. His father likely sacrificed his family for Paul Tech's success. A suspicious investor, a sudden divorce, and a lifetime of consequences. He bit back a surge of emotion and saved the article to his growing folder of evidence. As Michael finally crawled into bed, his resolve hardened. He would find out everything, every detail of how and why Richard Paul made the choices he did. And when the time was right, Michael would make sure Richard faced the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The winter sky was pale and overcast as Michael pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse archive room. Dust motes danced in the stale air. He had decided to spend his free afternoon combing through public records, hoping to find any filings or contracts related to Paul Tech's early years that might not be available online. If there was anything to be discovered about Gerald Thompson's involvement or other hidden dealings, it might be buried in these files. A helpful clerk led him to a stack of boxes in a corner. Paul Tech Incorporated, filings from roughly 20 years ago, she said, adjusting her glasses. Some of these are duplicates of what's in the digital system, but occasionally there are attachments or exhibits that didn't get scanned in. She gave Michael a curious glance. Working on a school project? Yes, Michael lied politely. A research project on local business ethics. It wasn't far from the truth, he thought wryly. She left him with the boxes and returned to her desk. Michael began sifting through manila folders and stapled documents. Most of it was routine. Incorporation forms, early employee contracts, stock issuance records. Then, near the bottom of the second box, Michael found something that made his breath catch. A copy of an early investment agreement dated around the time of that press release he'd read. Gerald Thompson's name was listed as a major stakeholder, with an appended note detailing a special condition. Thompson's company would retain a seat on Paul Tekka's board and had the right to retract funding if certain reputation standards were not met by the leadership. Michael's brow knit deeply as he read the vague but menacing wording. Reputation standards, that could mean anything, but in context, given what he suspected, it hinted at the investor's leverage over Richard's personal life. Thompson had legally bound his investment to Richard maintaining an image that wouldn't scare off conservative partners. Michael felt a flash of anger, so intense he had to set the paper down for a moment. That single clause may have been the noose around his mother's neck, around his own fate as an infant. He carefully photographed the document with his phone. This was a small but crucial piece of evidence. It didn't outright say don't have a mixed-race family, but knowing Thompson's history and reading between the lines, Michael could infer the pressure that must have been on Richard. Sliding the papers back into place, Michael left the courthouse archives with a mix of triumph and turmoil swirling in his chest. Snowflakes had begun to drift down, melting as they touched the ground. He tugged his coat tighter and headed to campus for his evening class, though he doubted he'd be able to focus on a lecture. During class, as the professor's words washed over him unheard, Michael's thoughts churned. He now had a clearer picture. An unethical investor with racist leanings, a desperate young CEO hungry for success, and a family cast aside to meet a standard. It was a sickening puzzle, but the final pieces were coming together. After class, Michael met with Professor Lee during office hours. Professor Lee was one of his favorites, a sharp former civil rights attorney who now taught ethics and the law. In the privacy of her book-lined office, Michael cautiously brought up a hypothetical scenario resembling his findings. He described a company with possible discriminatory practices rooted in its founding and asked what legal recourse there might be if someone had evidence of such things. Professor Lee listened thoughtfully, tapping a pen against her chin. Well, if someone had concrete evidence that a company's leadership engaged in discriminatory practices or breached contracts to favor discrimination, there could be grounds for a lawsuit. But it would depend on the specifics, the jurisdiction, and the statute of limitations. For older actions, say decades-old decisions, direct legal recourse might be time-barred unless there's a continuing violation or fraud that tolls the time. She peered at him over her glasses. Often, these things come to light through investigative journalism or internal whistleblowers rather than court, especially if it's something that happened years ago. It can certainly tarnish reputations, though, and influence current investigations into the company. Michael nodded, taking notes. His professor's words gave him a lot to consider. Perhaps direct legal action for what happened back then would be difficult. But shining a light on it could add fuel to the fire already surrounding Paul Tech. And if current discriminatory practices were being investigated, showing a historical pattern could be powerful. "Thank you, Professor," he said, standing up to leave. "This is really helpful for my understanding." Professor Lee gave him a curious smile. "Good luck with your understanding. And Michael," she added as he reached the door, "sometimes making things right isn't just about the law. It's also about confronting the people involved and demanding accountability. There's a lot of power in simply bringing truth into the open." Her perceptive gaze made Michael wonder if she guessed more than he had shared. He managed a grateful nod and left. That night at home, Michael spread all his collected printouts and notes across the kitchen table. Sona had gone to bed early with a headache, so he had the quiet space to himself. He organized everything. The archived investment agreement, the gossip column hinting at the divorce's cause, the details of Gerald Thompson scandals, and the more recent accounts of Paul Tekka's discrimination complaints. Michael's hand hovered over a photo clipped from an old magazine, a younger Richard Paul standing next to Gerald Thompson. Richard's face wore a triumphant smile as he held up a prototype gadget, oblivious to the darkness that Deal would cast over his personal life. Michael barely recognized that face. It was the face of a stranger, not the blurred memory of a father he held onto from baby pictures and his mother's stories. In that moment, Michael felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, even pity. Richard Paul had achieved everything he wanted in life: wealth, a renowned company, power. Yet he looked increasingly like a man on the verge of losing it all, haunted by ghosts he tried to forget. And Gerald Thompson, where was he now? A quick search had shown Michael that Thompson resigned from Paul Tekka's board after a few years and had since kept a low profile following his own scandal. He was still alive, though living in semi-retirement under the radar. Perhaps Thompson thought his secrets were safe. Michael gathered his papers into a folder. He knew what he had to do next, though the thought made his stomach flip. He needed to confront Gerald Thompson. If there was any man who might confirm the truth of why Richard made that fateful decision, it was Thompson. But approaching a man like that would be delicate, maybe even risky. Michael figured he could pose as a law student doing a research project, get Thompson to talk about Paul Tekka's early days. People love to brag about their successes, after all. As he mulled over a plan, across town Richard was in the midst of another restless night. Rain pattered against the large windows of his penthouse as he paced the living room. His private investigator's report lay on the coffee table. He hadn't looked at it yet. Just knowing it was there made his heart race. Inside would be answers about Sona and, more terrifyingly, about Michael. He poured himself a glass of water, hands unsteady. Slowly, Richard sat down and opened the thin dossier. The first page was a recent photograph of Sona, standing in front of a cheerful little restaurant, her smile warm as she handed a take-out bag to a customer. She had aged, of course, a few more lines on her face, but to Richard, she was as beautiful as ever. He traced a finger over the image, a ghost of a smile on his lips. She survived without me, he thought with a mix of admiration and shame. The next page held a photo of a young man in a graduation cap and gown, Michael, at his college graduation last year. Richard sucked in a breath. The boy, no the man, had Sona's proud stance and something of Richard's own face in him too. Michael's smile was bright, unguarded, full of hope. Richard's throat tightened painfully. The report noted Michael had enrolled in law school recently. "My son is a lawyer, or will be one," Richard marveled, pride and grief swirling within him. So Michael had grown up smart, ambitious, wanting to fight for justice. The irony was not lost on him that Michael was pursuing the very thing Richard had denied him: justice and acknowledgement. Richard turned the page. The investigator had also noted Michael's background: top of his class, an internship at a legal aid clinic during college, and even mention of the incident that purportedly inspired his career: standing up to a landlord who tried to evict a family friend unjustly. Richard felt a swell of pride reading about Michael's bravery. But then he saw the last note in the report. Richard's blood ran cold as he read. Subject: Michael White has recently been inquiring into Paul Tekka's early history. Observed at city archives reviewing old company documents. Richard's hand clenched around the edge of the paper. So his instincts had been right. Something from his past was coming for him. Michael was digging, asking questions about the company, about those early days. Richard's mind raced. Was Michael gathering ammunition for revenge? Or was he just seeking answers to his own life's mystery? A flash of panic shot through Richard. If Michael uncovered the truth about Gerald Thompson's involvement and the deal with the devil Richard had made, it could not only destroy what little remained of Richard's soul, but also publicly ruin Paul Tekka. Not to mention, it could put Michael in the crosshairs of powerful people who wanted those secrets buried. Richard realized with dawning horror that he was terrified for his son. Michael might be stirring up a hornet's nest. Gerald Thompson was an old man now, but still had connections and a reputation to protect. If Michael provokes him, Richard couldn't bear the thought of his son getting hurt, not after all this. He needed to stop Michael from digging further. But how? He had no relationship with him, no right to tell him anything. And if he reached out now, Michael would know he'd been essentially spying on him. Richard sank his head into his hands, anguish rippling through him. All these years he had stayed away, telling himself it was for the best. Now his absence had come full circle. He had no way to protect his own child from the danger Richard himself had created. Midnight came and went as father and son, miles apart. Each wrestled with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of what was to come. Michael sat in the glow of his research, preparing to take the next step toward uncovering the truth. Richard sat in the darkness of regret, knowing that the truth was on a collision course with the carefully constructed life he'd built. And in that sleepless night, both men, unaware of the other's exact thoughts, felt the same mixture of fear and determination. The past was no longer content to stay buried. It was rising slowly but surely, and when it finally surfaced, none of their lives would ever be the same.